Black Lives Matter is a movement about the liberation of Black folks nationally and worldwide, but it's also a coalition movement, right?
For anything, basically, we talk about education is going to be the answer for sure.
He says, empathy has a shelf life, but compassion is forever.
Sensations that spread experiences, which it's even more powerful than an idea, I think. If you combine those things together, it's just, there's no stopping that.
Welcome to the TheatreArtLife podcast. And hello, we're putting the spotlight on those who create live entertainment around the globe, the culture creators, the backstage masters. My name is Anna Aguilera.
And my name is Anna Robb.
This is one of our special episodes. Today, we are starting a conversation with Victor Garnier and Reagan P. Mitchell, where we approach the Black Lives Matter within the live entertainment community.
Victor is an experienced producer, production stage manager, and road manager. His work spans several decades developing projects in different industries, including music, theater, contemporary circus, and corporate events. He spent 15 years in Asia and has worked in all continents for companies such as Cirque du Soleil, Franco Dragón Entertainment Group, GSMA, Mobile World Congress Barcelona, SET, Sense Venetian Macau Limited, among others, as well as in entrepreneurial environments. He has recently relocated to Spain.
Reagan Patrick Mitchell is a faculty member of the Division of Liberal Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. He is a musician and a theorist focusing on ethnic studies, Black diaspora studies, critical race theory, critical geography, and sound studies. He's widely published in academic journals, including the Journal of Curriculum and Pedagogy, Journal of Curriculum Theorizing, Philosophy of Education Society Yearbook, and the International Journal of Curriculum and Social Justice. As a saxophonist, he has performed throughout Louisiana, Tennessee, Colorado, New York, Ohio, North Carolina, and South Carolina, along with recording as a soloist, composer / arranger, and accompanying musician. Welcome, guys, to the show. Thank you for really joining us on a very important topic. And before we get started with the tough questions, can you please maybe start with you, Victor, about where you're at and what you're doing, and then we'll move on to Reagan.
Okay, yeah. So I guess in short, it's 2020. I work in entertainment and things are looking really funky at this point in time. So mostly what I'm doing, it's pre-production for projects. I'm doing two main things: an audiovisual project, pre-production for next year, and then I'm booking actually a tour from an artist, a musical artist, also for next year. Even though we don't know if next year is going to be on, but we still have to act as if it would.
Keep the hopes high.
I mean, what are you going to do?
And Reagan, where are you at right now?
That's a very hard, very challenging, expansive one, but I'll keep this as short as possible. I recently just relocated to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where again I took the position. I was hired for the position in the Division of Liberal Arts. So right now, at this point, a lot of what I'm doing is I'm really trying to make sure. I teach in the humanities, particularly. I teach. Of course, there's some core courses such as first year seminar, self-society and cosmos, but also I've been involved in being able to actually build certain courses. So one of the courses that was one of my first babies, that I would say, at the university was the Black Diaspora Studies course. So, and I should say, like specifically, one of the things that I come at with thinking about education is really understanding first and foremost that a lot of these issues, in the broadest senses, are very much an educational issue, right? And specifically, I'm very fascinated when we think about Black folks, right? We think about the diaspora. When I talk about the diaspora, the Black diaspora, I'm talking about not only nationally, but worldwide, right? How do we necessarily begin to think about sort of these larger curricular systems of being, knowing, and doing? So this is what I'm fascinated in. This is really what I talk about. This is what's the stuff that I try to bring to the university, and particularly in the classroom.
And we've been going a little bit onto the topic before I start asking unrelated questions. Black Lives Matter started as a movement in 2013 after the murder of Trayvon Martin. And then it picked up some moment again now after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Can you guys tell us a little bit more about the movement and what is Black Lives Matter?
Reagan, I'll defer to you. Maybe if you're okay with that, because Black Lives Matter is a movement that started over there in the States. So I think it's maybe a good starting point, and it takes very different shapes here in Europe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first and foremost, I think it's important that we understand Black Lives Matter as really a coalition movement, right? And I would even and I always venture back further because you listen to the development of Black Lives Matter. I think one of the things is perhaps one of the most important things that we take on is that really this is a very, even though we understand it under the guise of Black Lives Matter, this is very much a movement that is a very ancient movement, right? I think as long as we think about the history of what has been the treatment of Black folks nationwide, it's been very much, first of all, we understand it as a national movement, but we also understand it as a transnational movement, right? So I think it's really important and very enriching that we're having this conversation about Black Lives Matters and very much what it means to understand it along boundaries or state-sanctioned boundaries of sorts, right? But Black Lives Matter, in all, I would say it's a coalition movement. Right, it's a coalition movement that's very much that's very much a critique on how we historically understand Black movements, right, and also really much more of a discussion of really thinking about very much the complexity that does affect Black folks, but also what is it necessarily? It's also a deeper question about thinking about what does it mean to really get into this process of world building, do equity building, right? So I'm thinking about, as I say this, one of the things that's really powerful when we talk about these movements is really historically and sometimes the beef that you go through when you're in like Africana studies departments or you talk about Black studies departments, really this whole discussion of how we've talked about Black history has very much been rooted. It's very much, first of all, it's rooted in a narrative of enslavement. Right, not saying that that's the only discussion, but that's part of it, right? So, and also, it's always a discussion about colonization of the Americas of sorts, right? So, I think one of the things that's really powerful about Black Lives Matter is really it's of now, but it's also it is also a deep reflection and reflexivity on the history, and also it's very much a movement of dreaming. Right, a dreaming of what does it necessarily mean to imagine sort of this future and have this sense of futurity as we progress into thinking about the now and what does it necessarily mean to get towards a liberatory space for Black people, but also thinking about the process of what does it mean to build coalitions in the process of building this deeper equity building worldwide, right? So Black Lives Matter is not something that's meant to sit exclusively within talking about Black folks, but it's like, the part of the thing that I think is powerful is like, okay, so what does it necessarily mean for all Choctaw communities to get free, right? Black Lives Matter takes on this whole point of thinking about what does it mean to talk about this whole point of thinking about the notion of ability, right? What qualifies as an able-bodied person, right? And what is the hegemony around body, right? What does it mean and first and foremost, what does it mean to really take like these very ancient conversations of Black feminism, right? And really unfold them in a different way, which is, I think, is the power, and really the power we understand when we think about our founders like Alicia Garza, right? They're picking up these very ancient ideas and these organizing ideals that were very much in the ancestors of Black women, right? I think that's another thing to really think about Black Lives Matter. So it's a very ancient movement, but it's also very much a movement of dreaming about these processes of equity building in the present, right? What does it mean? And I would say what's even more interesting, like, I think that to really kind of rock with what you were talking about, the cultural change, I would also tap back in thinking that when we talk about cultural change, is so many other things, right? Because it's simultaneously like this whole process of existence, but it's also this whole point of how do we necessarily think about policy, right? So if you look at specifically Black Lives Matter, you understand, and particularly think about some of the offshoots, like thinking about the Black Futures Lab, right? That's very much a policy organization. That's very much organization that's very much built around thinking about voting policy, really thinking about really the disparagement and inequity that has really affected Black folks, particularly around incarceration. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, you should really check out really this. But so all in,
it's
so
huge. The list
exactly.
is huge.
So, but I would say first and foremost, just to circle back around, Black Lives Matter is a movement about the liberation of Black folks nationally and worldwide, but it's also a coalition movement, right? So the thing about it, like I always think it's fascinating. And I think the beautiful thing about it is, okay, like for instance, like you show up, you think about like just local organizing here in North Carolina, right? You show up now, if you show up at Siembra, right? Siembra in North Carolina, right? You also see a lot of, you see Black Black Lives Matter people showing up, right? At the same time, you show up with the Poor People's Campaign, right? Which started by King, right? Then you see folks from Black Lives Matter, right? So understand it's a coalition movement in the strongest sense.
I just wanted to add that Siembra, North Carolina is a group, for what I understand, it's mostly made out of Latino, but they deal with immigration issues in the state of North Carolina. And they have been very supportive of the Latino community.
So Victor, how's that manifested over in Spain, and has it maybe pre George Floyd and then post George Floyd? Obviously, the George Floyd situation has ignited certain movements globally, and I'd just like to hear from your perspective, because it's nice to see what that's ignited around the world. So tell us about that.
Yeah, definitely the George Floyd, I don't know how to call it, episode. It seems like, anyway, sparked a lot of discussion, a lot of energy towards the movement. It's nice to hear from you, Reagan, talking about and describing Black Lives Matter, because I think there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of conflicting opinions all around. And of course in Europe it's also the same. So Black Lives Matter, of course we have been aware in Europe and Spain of the movement for quite a while, but somehow it's popularly to call it in some way being seen as something very North American based, very US based. Something like, racism is something that happens in the US and all of that, especially because Europeans, Spanish people and Europeans, we love to say, no, we're not racist here. We are very inclusive and very tolerant. And yes, it's true in some aspects, of course. But definitely all the differences in between the individuals are always somehow frowned upon, and Black people and Afro descendants are no less of that. Maybe in Europe, a particularity that happens here, maybe it's the fact that as there might not be as many Black people as in the States, there's many more Muslim people. So a little bit of that gets switched into the Muslim communities, a little bit of that feeling. And that's why in the article I wrote for the website, I was talking about Black and Afro descendant. I don't know if you use that distinction in the States as well. But that's the way I saw it was relevant to present it because of this reason. But anyway, actually, today I was reading an article on The Economist precisely about Black Lives Matter and racism in Europe, and they were basically saying this, that I'm bringing up, that in Europe racism has been something that has never or seldom been in the forefront, even though it happens every day, maybe because of a matter of numbers, like I was saying. But it is there, and there's a lot of people that experience those things. Maybe it's possibly in many cases and in many situations in much more subtle and sophisticated ways that sometimes we see happening in the States.
Is there a coalition in terms of, like, is there people forming committees to work against that in your part of the world, or is it more just a reflection of what's happening in the States?
Little by little, people are getting a little bit more organized, and certain organizations are making the voices heard. It's definitely maybe not as strong a movement as in the States, but little by little, and especially after this George Floyd incident, people are starting to speak up a little more, and discussions are held more often. Dissenting voices are coming up. It's interesting. It's interesting. Last week, I posted the article I wrote in TheatreArtLife website and on Facebook. And of course, I had a lot of friends who were like, "Yeah, this is a great article. Thanks for that." La la la. And there were also a lot of people who immediately, as you know how social networks work, immediately jump into the conflict wagon. No, I mean, comments of the type of Black Lives Matter is a racist movement, and things like that, That is like, I mean, I don't know. For me,
there was.
Hard
I literally followed that. I followed that thread, and I obviously, as the managing director of the website, I'm not gonna. I observe a lot of the social media, whether it be positive or negative, for feedback. I think it's a good it's a good platform to sort of understand, and then also, if I feel, obviously not on that platform, there needs to be a diffusion of the subject. Then if I feel like I could diffuse the thing. And a lot of the time, and maybe we'll revert back to Reagan in terms of maybe your thoughts on this. For me, it's about education, right? Like, a lot of the people that would make a mass assumption about what Black Lives Matter may not actually know. And I refer to Reagan's version of it's a coalition, and people have got to really understand what are those systemic ingrained things that they are not aware of that put them in a more advantageous position over people who are of color. And I think that's really to really start to understand. And I really love it, especially in the entertainment industry, because if you look at, say, what stories are getting told, is it the white person stories with white producers, with white directors, and so, like, breaking that apart and seeing that systemic structure. And it's not the biggest thing is it's not really against the white people. It's just that it's not inclusive of everybody that's around in the community. So again, I'm not the expert, but I feel like, Reagan, do you want to sort of put, like, what does local organizations do, and what is the ways and what's the roadmap towards, one, making people aware, educating them, and then shifting that perception of the Black Lives Movement?
Well, I mean, if we could just iron out hegemony altogether, then that would solve it all. But since that's since that's not quite, since it's not what's in style for a lot of people. What else? What I say is that I think one of the beautiful things that we're all talking about, or the tension that we're talking about, is really this idea of incremental change, right? So I think that there is, once again, you look at some of the histories of movements, right? You look at, like, people that have done this work, right? You look at, like, how we're learning, right? We learn that really this idea of incremental change is, like, deeply embedded in the commitment, but also understanding that it's not necessarily something that we, it's just all of a sudden, it is done. I would argue even further. I think one of the things that's really what's important about Black Lives Matter is really as it becomes this whole locus, this analytical locus or loci to really kind of push and say, like, there's, like, been a continuum of problems that have been occurring, right? And I mean, like, now if I talk about it from the standpoint of being black, queer, and from a Southern space, right? What does this necessarily mean? That this gives me a very specific understanding of what has going on, and really which voices get left out and intentionally railed out, and one, I'm kind of doing this broader maybe historiography or whatever sorts to kind of say like these are the contexts that we're facing now. If you were to say like, well, what's the roadmap? I don't know if there's necessarily a roadmap as much as there is commitment, right? I don't know if there's necessarily a roadmap as much as there is a commitment to equity, and I was having this in fact, right? Like, what does it mean to really be engaged in equity, right? Because I think a lot of times there's like this fundamental thing where we think that it's somehow we supplement equity with equality, right? You can just flip-flop that, and it's like, no, not at all. Actually, equity is like, that is something like, you need to actually come up off a lot, right? And there's really like this whole accountability, right? This whole different sort of accountability. So one, if you start talking about, this is why, once again, why I'd say the whole coalition element is really important to understand. Like, you start understanding what this whole point of equity comes in, then it's like, okay, if you're talking about just like, North America, then it's like, okay, that means people got to come up off indigenous land, right? Like if we start talking about these points of equity, then people got to start pulling interstates out of these neighborhoods, right? If we, the list keeps on going, right? So there's like this whole point where I talk about the reflective, but then the reflexive, right? I think the reflective elevates this whole situation that we understand like as you have brought up, Anna and Anna, this whole point of like where do we go from here? I think there's there's definitely that point of the reflexivity that comes in, right? There's the point of the reflexivity that comes in. There's the point of the reflection where we say, oh my gosh, like there is like sort of this web of the problematic, right? But I think that there's something really powerful about the reflexivity, because it's like, what does it mean how do we get changed through that? And how do we necessarily, even beyond the change, how do we begin to understand that as sort of a praxis, right? So, and this is, once again, when we talk about any sort of, I think when you talk about Black movements, especially when you talk about Black Lives Matter, especially when you talk about movements undergirded, and that I'll always argue till I'm blue in the face. I argue this with other Black scholars. I said, I think you got to understand first and foremost, it's all these ideas about movement building that we have, especially in the States. It's always going to be a Black feminist queer. It's ethos and ethic that undergirds us getting this, right? Understand, King is powerful because women picked him to push that cause forward, right? And it's like, but the thing is, for me, it's always about thinking about the radical black queer feminists, right? Thinking about how that works and really how that's undergirded this movement, right? So I think that there's one thinking about sort of thinking about what the continuum is that we've existed in, but I think there's also a point in thinking about how it is that what it means to live in now with this, and then it's sort of that point of the reflection and the reflexivity within this context that helps us really begin to think about like where do we step next? But this is the whole thing. Like I think that is a messy thing. That is a messy, painful, but a very important, conversation. I think the bigger issue is that there's this whole way that people create, and this is different through different points of privilege, whether we're talking about the racial hierarchies, whether we're talking about the class privilege, whether we're talking about that through violent heteronormativity, whether we're talking about that through notions of ability. There's a way that this is, I think, once again, when I come back to the point of like, well, if we could just get rid of hegemony, then this will, solve a lot of things really quickly. Like, I think that there's that whole other point where when we talk about this issue, when we talk about the understanding that the step forward, the map forward, that is something that is ever changing, right? And I think if anything, like we think about like, okay, now there's Trayvon Martin. Now I'm also, I've lived 7 years of my life in Louisiana. So, Alton Sterling was murdered 2.5 miles from my house where I was living, right? Right. So then we talk about this whole thing when we talk about with Alton Sterling, right? So there's also, but the thing is, but also we think about what about these Black trans women that have been murdered, right? So it's like when we start really thinking about this and really thinking about sort of the state saying what the nature of the state sanctionhood that makes it okay for this to exist or rationalizes why one body is worthy and why another body is not worthy along these different lines, that presents a whole nother set of ethics that overlaying ethics that's always been that's at play. And I think that's the one powerful thing I think that's what Black Lives Matter does, right? It doesn't say like, this is the set of ethics. It's like, no, this means there's a different set of responsibilities that we're constantly trying to maneuver, right? And I think that's a really powerful thing that you bring up, Victor, right? There's like this whole other series that we've got to like deal with,
Interesting. Yeah. No, I was thinking about what Reagan was saying and what you introduced. You were talking about education, and I think that's definitely a central point. Actually, I mean, for anything, basically, we talk about education is going to be the answer for sure. I think definitely around what I see, I cannot speak for the States, but I have a feeling it's going to be similar. Most people are not. Most people that oppose the movement or don't understand it or don't comprehend it are not being intellectually dishonest. That's my opinion.
Yes,
they're just following certain speakers they have who usually are intellectually dishonest and carrying everybody behind them and supporting and repeating arguments and repeating ideas that they're not completely clear where they come from or what they mean in many cases. So against that, at the end of the day, it's propaganda, right? In front of that, the first thing you have to do is educate. Education that leads us as a society, educate people, that leads us as a society to an awareness, because it's easy to understand that if you're not born Black, or like you were saying, LGBTQ, neurodiverse, that you don't understand, you're not aware of the issues that affect this collective. I think that's normal. That's just humanity. That's why through education we can spark this awareness that hopefully can lead us to empathy about the issue, that hopefully can lead us to action. That's kind of the way I see the nice and natural process also, which I think it's important, because otherwise we always end up with this plethora of like what I was saying, these discussions on social networks where people are calling themselves names and they're just repeating arguments they heard somewhere, but there's no real dialogue, there's no real discussion, there's no listening really. It's all repeating things. So we need to educate. We need to educate people around us. We need to talk to people, not lecturing them somehow, because and guilty as charged. Sometimes you see yourself lecturing people, and hell, you think about it. It's like, okay, well, you were trying to do something, but through using this tool, what I'm getting is rejection from the other person. I'm not educating, even though I might be trying, but I'm not educating. I'm just causing rejection. So, and I think it's a very natural thing also for the human being for all of us to complain about others, to put the blame on others, no matter who we are, no Black, white, whatever. That's kind of like a very human thing, I think. You see it around all the time. We like to complain about others. We like to put the blame on others. It's very hard to do self-criticism all the time, no? And where do we put these complaints? Who do we find to blame? Usually we find people who are different, minorities who are different, and usually in weaker positions. So, well, under this category fall, as we were saying, Reagan, not only Reagan and Anas, not only Black Lives Matter, but LGBTQ people, the movement of feminism. It's very, very intertwined, and all these, I think, all these things happening around the world, and that was basically the point I was trying to make, actually.
No, and I think what you're saying is, education is really, and what's been, on the fringe, I'm on the opposite side of the world, but what's been really amazing, I think, in the George Floyd situation is, we talk about Black Lives Matter, but it's not a Black movement. It's a movement for everyone, and white people, and everybody has to be on board for that to change, I feel like. And so, and I think that's, that whole verbiage, what is it, that all lives matter. Well, that's just, I mean, I don't want to sit there and comment, but the reality is, if you think that that's the right thing to say, then you don't see the issues, really, because all lives matter, of course, when obviously everybody is treated equally.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I watched it, I thought it was really wonderful, because there was a rapper in America, I think it was a rapper, and he put a video online, and he'd just bought a new car, and he'd had like temporary license plates on his car. So the police pulled him up to check that it was his car and stuff like that. And this guy was like, well, I get pulled up by cops all the time. This is my normal thing, And while he was waiting for the cops to check his credentials and his purchase and everything like that, a white lady had stopped her car and was videoing him in his car and the police and the interaction and everything. And he was like really confused. He's like, why are you here? And then he realized she was being an ally, right? She was filming it. And when the cop had finished and walked away, she sort of gave him a, "Are you okay?" thumbs up. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm okay." And he was like, really like, I got an ally, I've got an ally here in this thing. And so I feel like that is when other people of my skin color see that and act on it, not just, I can have an opinion, but unless I'm actually participating in this coalition. And I think, I mean, maybe, you can agree about how much or how, people should be participating. But as a white person, for me, it's up for me to participate in that movement as well. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that there's something really, I think that there's one of the things I always talk about with one of my girlfriends. I'm going to shout her out, Dr. Bonnie Wazalik. One of the things that I think is beautiful that I had her come into one of my classes at another institution. One of the things that we were discussing is, I think that there was a whole discussion there was an issue of like even pushing allyship further, right? Because it's like, if you put your body, it's because it's like, yeah, you can be an ally by like having an opinion or like posting about it, but like, are you willing to like put your body on the line? Are you willing to like take the hand of a community, whether it's literally, so there's also a point where you have to push towards the allyship and also push towards being an accomplice. I think that's a difficult thing, right? I think that there are a bunch of difficulties, and this is not also on my part. I want to make sure that this is not a discussion about authenticity, right? This is not an authenticity discussion, right? Because I think that there's got to be another point where we talk about it's also a certain point. It's a certain thing that's important. It's a value to really making sure that you're able to you also try to take somewhat care of yourself, right? So that you can be in the service of others, right? That's the case. If you want to continue this longevity and service to others, that's also a point where you have to really think about like these points of self-care. And once again, give it up to, Saint Audre Lorde on that, right? They wrote really beautifully and really wrote this really, really important treatise on self-care, right? And activism, right? So I think that, and I think that also just kind of rocking back with a few points that you presented, Victor, which I think it's important to always ask the question about who, if we talk of, or I think it's Victor and actually Eliel said it. Okay, let me get it right. But I think that we always have to process this larger issue of like there's the reflexive question, like, what is it going to mean for a person to really, for bodies to get free, for people to get free, for communities to get free? And that means a lot of different things, right? This is why I always throw the equity. That's why I always make sure the equity piece is in there and that people understand, like, make sure I don't want to hear you say equality. I want you to hear you say equity, because that means that you really need to deal. But I mean, so for instance, like, one of the things I'm always going to shout out Sister Pauli Murray, right? That was out of, of course, out of North Carolina. She was born in Maryland or whatever, but she's she is one of our most important legal scholars, right? I think she's I always make the argument, I said, like, understand, she really helped co-author that very important legal brief, Jane Crow, in Title IX, right? And one thing that was really powerful about that, well, just about Pauli Murray's life, but like, I think one of the things that could go on that was really powerful about thinking about somebody like Murray is that it is also a critique of her existence, or her non-acknowledgement is really a discussion of how we think about sort of this infighting and what it is that Black Lives Matter gives us the possibility to do, right? Understand, Pauli Murray wrote States' Rights on Race and Color, and she wrote that in 1951. She wrote that approximately 3 years before the Brown versus Board of Education mandate, making separate but equal unconstitutional. She writes that, right, in 1951. And who is it that we necessarily sort of give the credit to? We give it to Thurgood Marshall. But understand, Thurgood Marshall read Pauli Murray in order to really be able to have sort of legal teeth, to really have that conversation, really craft that mandate. Understand, a Black queer body, a Black queer feminist body made that, wrote that, gave that legal teeth of sorts, right? So I always want to make sure that I shout that out. And I think that's always important to really, once again, when we begin to think about sort of this history of the movement and what it means to really think about, like, what it means for people to get free. Understand, now going back to this legal brief she co-authors, like the Jane Crow, remember, she says at the end of it all, because they write this, it's Murray and Eastwood write this a year after the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964. Remember, but they say, what do they say? They say, remember, women's rights are civil rights, or human rights, right? So once again, we have to think about, what does it mean to necessarily think about this notion of, when we talk about ideas of human rights, even how they were really talking about this deep radical coalition of sorts, but also understanding that in the process of even just thinking about, like, Black folks getting free, varieties of and communities of Black folks getting free, the process of getting free is also one of many other bodies getting free in the process,
Mm.
As you guys talk about education and human rights and the different how it has affected each one of your communities and how it works around the world, another thing that it comes to my mind when we speak about Black Lives Matter, and I know it's important for the movement itself, and it's personally it's an issue that touches me deeply. It's the sense of community. And I think when we speak about education, we often think of either like talking to your immediate others about the subject that you already kind of agreed. Like, if I'm talking to my roommate, she knows what I think. So yes, maybe I can educate her a little bit more, but I think it is important to see community as a space where we can grow and where we can educate, and to bring and make communities a little bit more diverse so we can have this kind of dialogues. And at the same time, I see us as a live entertainment community, or like, we are a community. And the number of times I've gone to a completely different city or a completely different country, and I've been told, hey, you should call X, Y, or Z, and they're my friend, and they'll hook you up with something, they'll help you out, you can stay at their place. That is a real sense of community. So what is the role of live entertainment as a community with Black Lives Matter? And maybe backing up a little bit, should we talk a little bit about the importance of community and building community within the Black Lives Matter movement.
Obviously, art and live entertainment are very important. They're a part of the media ecosystem. There's a part of, I mean, there are spread industry that spread ideas that, but not only ideas that spread sensations, that spread experiences, which is, it's even more powerful than an idea. I think if you combine those things together, it's just, there's no stopping that. So in that sense, yes, we do have a role and we do have a responsibility, and for the most part, I think a lot of artists and entertainers all around the world have taken up to the role. Yes, very important role. I think live and art and live entertainment have and will always have a role, and will always have to juggle that role. That I think it's a native role of these industries, tied up with the money that moves these industries, no? Because obviously, when you are working with whoever who sells 10,000 tickets a night or whatever, you have to be very careful about the message you launch and in what form you launch it. And oftentimes the message gets lost in the way in this environment. So I think that's kind of a challenge for art and entertainment. Somehow the relationship with the structures, with, I don't know how to call it, the structures that produce shows, the companies that produce shows, where the money comes from, because with money comes, always some sort of responsibility, some sort of interest. So the artist, the entertainer, cannot go against that, even though oftentimes we do somehow. Yeah.
Do you want to weigh in on that, Reagan, in terms of entertainment and community and our role to play in this movement?
I mean, I love this. I love this inquiry, and I love that we're having it very publicly, or it's going to be very public, right? Because I think, okay, this is the thing that I think it's very interesting that we're all dealing with, right? I mean, there's always that. I always think about that line, right? And I was talking to you about it on the phone the other day, and I was like, people love the expressions of the culture, but they don't love the people that create it, right? There's always that point, right? That can really go a variety of different ways, right? Of course, when I say that, I'm always thinking about, like, man, I mean, I think we love the expressions of Black queer culture, right? But we don't love Black queer folk enough. Right?
It happens so much, and
right,
it's so
right.
So
right.
It also happens with blues, with soul music, with hip hop, all of that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll let you continue.
No. This is what it's about, man. You know what I'm saying?
No. As I was telling Reagan that day with that conversation, it's like, and it hurts to a point, is I don't understand why people like tacos so much, but they really don't like us as a community.
Look, you love that. You love everything that comes. You love stuff that comes, like the idea of sustenance that comes from, like, people that are economically disadvantaged, right? You love all these things. It's like, it's so funny. Even when you just thinking of it, like, taking it in a food ways direction, right? I mean, it's like, like, I grew up eating these things, but I would not go pay, $50 for a plate of chitlins, but I grew up eating that stuff, and it's like really important. I'm not knocking it. I'm not knocking eating or whatever, but I think that there's, like, you look at that, or just like these certain cuts, or like these things, or eating kale, like all these things are looked at as like these chic, like, foodways things, right? But then it's like you don't want to understand. First of all, that comes out of, like, communities that are economically disadvantaged, right? So they're like all these points and these expressions and the love of the culture, right? But you don't want to necessarily love the people, right? So but I want to make sure that I come back to responsibility and entertainment. And I want to make sure, because Victor says this is how I do it. Now, and one of the things that I do is that I mean, first and foremost, before I went back in the classroom, I was a working musician. And I mean, I still am a working musician. I don't want to say I am still working musician, but one of the things that I always say is like, because the music I do is, is jazz, would be classified as jazz music. A lot of different projects I've been involved with. There's still there's this other point where it's like, I always walk in like a class. One of the classes I've taught in the past is a class on Black music, right? And a lot of times people think that they're going to get like this linear progression of Black music, and I'm like, no. I want you to understand it's a web, right? Because there's a very problematic colonial construct of sort of linear time, and we have to look at historically what that's done for how we think about how historical discourse, and not only discourse, but the complexity of discourse around people, right? And I think that's a really important point that you bring up about the consumerism, right? There's something about like the way consumerism works and the linearity of time that makes it impossible and suppresses certain discourses, right? The complexity of the discourse, right? So one of the things one of the conversations, I said the question I always pose to the class is, what does it mean to play music in which the people that you look up as sort of these gods and creators couldn't walk in the front door? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And to me, there's always that point in just thinking about live entertainment, right? Where I want to make sure that I sort of clear that palette, right? I want to make sure that I'm resetting that and be like, look, I want you to remember at the end of the day, I think you think that John Coltrane's Alabama is so pretty and soothing or whatever, but remember, he played that in angst and the state-sanctioned support of murdering those 4 young women in Alabama, right? Because remember, it was Birmingham, Alabama, Birmingham, right? And this is not a slam on the South or whatever, because I always rep the South. I'll always say that the South gives us sort of these ways of understanding the entire nation. And I would even say, even from the global South, a place like Louisiana, it gives a whole different way of understanding these discourses, right? So it's very important that we always shout. The South is a big important thing for me, right, in my work. But I always say, y'all love John Coltrane's Alabama composition, Alabama, but remember, he wrote that in response to this state-sanctioned excusing of the murder of 4 young Black women in the Jackson Street Church, right? That's what he wrote that, right? So there's something like when we also talk about live entertainment, we always need to make sure to put forth to people like, you need to understand where the social context of all of this is, right? Because there is a social context, right? And I think in many ways, that gets us open to thinking about much art, right? So much art that we love comes out of poor communities, right? I think that, so it's like always this, and it's like, I love this, like Victor, I love this thing that you're like rocking with, right? Because it's like, it makes you think like, well, I mean, like, what's the conundrum? Like, how is it that you're going to charge all this money for people to be able to access this art, which in many ways was in their communities, right? What does it mean to necessarily create the big thing the issue I have in the US, right? And especially around live entertainment is there's sort of this subsidizing of smaller community venues. Right? Why isn't that a lot more of a widespread thing, right? Versus when we think about a Lincoln Center or a Kennedy Center, right? I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm talking about I think there's important point of equity, right? And I think that's an important point that you're rocking with, Victor, that I'm always struggling with when I think about live entertainment, right? Being part of it or going in and being able to have sort of this economic access to be able to just drop some bread and go in and see whoever,
Yeah, I understand. I always say there's the music and there's the a musician as well, and I've worked as a musician for many years now. I haven't done it for a while, but still, I always say there is music and then there's
the music industry. And they're two different things.
Yeah.
And
The
in
music
many
and the music
cases,
industry,
they're
I like
separate
that.
things.
Oh, say that again, bro, over and over.
I also see it as two things. On the one side is the message we convey as a community, but also looking into the community. I was reading today about Metropolitan Opera and some complaints they've had because they have all these operas written by white people that portray people of color, but these people of color have been represented traditionally by white people, and then they go on and put costumes and makeup to be someone they're not, right? So I think there's these two conversations that are very important. One is the message we convey outside and to the world, and then what do we do with our own industry and to ourselves, to our community.
This is a huge subject, and I think that spreads across live performance, the history of art, and also we're talking about music, and everybody. There's been this dominance over the and that's, I think, from a white person's perspective, it's there to undo all of that and then start to bring that diversity in, and going back to your education point, Reagan, and I've decided I need to come to your classes because I think I'd learn a lot from you, to bring people through from, you can't just turn around and give somebody my age, that director's position because they haven't had the access to what I may have had access throughout my life. So where does that begin? It has to begin with, they need that opportunities when they're a child. They need that opportunities to learn to play. They need those opportunities to be the star performer in the school play. They need the opportunities to try their hand at directing when they're a teenager. They need all of those foundational steps that generally some people of minorities have not had access to be able to give them that role and that response, like those larger roles within the arts institutions. And so that, for me, is, when I think about that, it's such an overwhelming task, and so, how do you undo what you've got and start to do that? And I mean, for people of color, I can't imagine the frustration, 2 steps forward, 10 steps back, 2 steps forward, it's just a frustrating concept. And so, when you were aware of issues, what I want to do is just shake the blanket and have it all fixed, and it's just not that, it just can't be done like that. So I want to help, and I also want to help, one, by having these discussions, but also start to put those foundations in a sense that we can make that shift. And I mean, how do you think, you guys, from your perspective internally, we could work on those steps?
I mean, so there are things that I'm always, first of all, I'm always making sure that I tie it back to the understanding the essential things that you love so much about, what you might love so much about all of us, come from community. For me, it comes from community, right? So and I'm thinking about, part of my, while I might have done 2 degrees of music or whatever, or existed very much in the institution, been institutionally trained, part of that is a very public discussion that I have about a lot of this that you love so much of is because of my community, right? Which that's that community is a lot of things, but remember that community is at the root is a very black community, a very unapologetically black understanding and way of being in existence, right? I tell people this, and I often tell classes, I said everything that you love about me is because of my community. And anyways, it becomes a whole way to kind of sort of extrapolate and really explain these are some very specific things that either I learned in sort of spiritual communities, Black spiritual communities, or queer or Black queer communities, or, like the list keeps on going on, right? So I'm very public about that discourse, right? Now, I think what's really interesting is there's like, of course you have like, I have these things I love. I mean, there's also this funkiness that you deal with, right? When you start talking about this, because it's like, sometimes our home is not necessarily where the love is, right? So sometimes acknowledging very publicly where those issues lie, So, but I think when it's sort of through the act of doing that in a way I've found in situations where that makes it a situation, being somebody that is hinged with the powers of the institution in some way. I need to make sure I would acknowledge these things of how I exist and make it very much a way that I'm able to exist in a certain way, in a very problematic way in certain ways, right? Because I've got the hand of the institution, right? But so there's a point of where I undo these things, right? These things that you think maybe because I got a PhD, I clearly know everything after my PhD, right? And a lot of things I don't know. I mean, I think if anything, the process of doing that taught me so much that I don't know. I think the process of life is unknowing.
Yeah.
The
older you get, the more you realize you don't know.
Goddamn thing, you know what I'm saying? But so there's that, but then there's also the whole part of how I also am like, hey, I think it's important that you understand that there are these certain ways of being, these certain pedagogies that didn't start in an ivory tower for you, right? There's these certain ways of being, right? And so a lot of the work, even when I talk about education, I'm not talking, I mean, like I say education, but then even people that do education, depending on who they are, if they're so tied to the ivory tower sort of notion, they would be like, oh, come on, you're not doing education. But I would say, no, I'm doing education, right? Because I'm always like curious about thinking about the complexity, understanding that people that come into a classroom, they represent a community, a series of pedagogies, a way of being and existing, right? Pedagogies of joy, pedagogies of survival, right? And I think that's part of when we talk about education, part of the thing that where the failure has been in sort of this whole point of really the whitewashing of what counts as valid knowledge, right? The question is always that's always the point. What counts as valid knowledge? Whose knowledge is valuable knowledge, right? And what are sort of the political ramifications and undergirdings that undergird that when you talk about like knowledge, or you say to a Black kid, right, that speaks in a black vernacular, or you talk to somebody that maybe has 3 or 4 different languages already, or 3 or 4 other different languages, but they speak with the accent that clearly there's something that you clearly are not, you're clearly not very, you're not very intellectual or whatever, right? Like there's a whole other series of things that we have to unfold, right? And that's the thing that I'm always trying to work through a little very directly when we talk about education and in these spaces, like what is it that you bring from your community?
Yeah, it's quite similar. Similar but different in terms of in Australia, we were not taught a lot about Aboriginal history. Mm-hmm. Which you think about the thousands of years of Aboriginal heritage and our like mere blip of white, white infiltration into the country of Australia, and then we grow up with that ignorance, and so if it's not part of that infiltration of the education system where you understand that as a community, an Australian community, we are made up of, yes, these white representation, but also a longer history. And like, why would we be avoiding this beautiful history that we have, that we should be so proud of? Not what we did to them when we came to the country and slaughtered them all, like we didn't even bring them as slaves, we just killed them, So like there's a sordid history there that Australia is trying to come to terms with still to this day. And my auntie, actually, she works for a university over there, and they're working to getting into the university systems in Australia. Every subject that you study, that there's some part of Aboriginal curriculum in your course, so you start to bring that into your education system, and I think those little foundations can be starting to plant seeds for a longer term change in culture, and change in thoughts and stuff. And so for you, Victor, is there certain things that are happening in the community like that in Spain in terms of like publicly addressing the changing culture or in education, do you know?
There's plenty of actions we can all do today that are easy and immediate for us to start anytime. We can start declaring publicly that we are anti-racist. We can stop supporting entities or people who promote these behaviors and attitudes and who make this kind of speeches their way of communicating. You can also register to vote. Voting is important. Voting is a very easy, quote unquote, easy tool we have to change the reality that surrounds us somehow. We can vote for candidates who make the fight for equality and against racism a priority. We can donate as our lives get busy and we don't have time to contribute ourselves to this cause. We can make a donation to a trusted organization that fights for equality and against systemic racism. Something I feel is also important, maybe having a conversation with friends or family members who are racially prejudiced or support politicians with racist agendas. I think it's important to underline the word conversation and try to really have a conversation, a dialogue, not a conference, as sometimes these kind of conversations tend to end up being. We can protest safely and peacefully for this and other causes that we might think worth supporting. There's a number of things we can start doing right now, but might take some time to crystallize into tangible results. We can read, watch, and listen to resources on systemic racism, libraries, internet, podcasts. Information is everywhere. Studies. Information is everywhere. We just have to reach out and find it. We can take the time to examine past moments when we did not do our best to denounce racist words or actions. We can do a little soul searching to try and locate the things inside us that trigger racist thoughts or stereotypes. Start working to eradicate them from your unconscious thoughts and start realizing that oftentimes the kind of attitudes and behaviors stem from very unconscious reactions to these things. For non-Black people, you can look more closely to identify the ways in which the color of your skin affords you experiences, big or small, whatever kind of experiences you might have in your life, that others cannot experience based on the color of their skin. This doesn't mean that your life isn't hard. It just means that the color of your skin isn't the thing making it that way. And last but not least, and I tend to bring up this in mostly all kinds of contexts, because it's something that I believe it can change our perception and our awareness of things, and this is what we're ultimately talking about. And so I recommend meditation. Meditation is a great mind tool to gain focus, awareness, and being able to identify and see the world around us a little bit more objectively. Our task ultimately must be to transform fear, hatred, and other negative emotions into awareness and empathy, compassion that drives us to action.
So again, Victor, you had a series of suggestions or ideas on how we could, as individuals, help each other and help ourselves as well to learn more and to read more. And you had, I thought it was I like the idea how you portray it on the articles, what we can do right now to better ourselves, and then what we can do that might not have an impact just now, but it would be good on the mid or long term. Do you want to talk about it?
In the article I was mentioning, it was kind of like not very so much related to the issue, and as I was reading the article, I realized. But I always bring it up because I think it's an incredible tool that I use. Meditation in this path to awareness is a tool that's amazing, and there's actually a lot of science behind it by now. So it's not a matter of beliefs. And I'm not talking about beliefs. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about meditation. Meditation is a mind technique. It's a very, I would say, it's the center of this work of awareness, and it helps a lot. So that's something that I recommend pretty much in any case. Also in this one, yeah, start meditating as often as your busy lives allow you to, please. That helps all of us.
I think that's a great list. Reagan, you got anything to add to that?
I mean, well, first of all, beautiful. I mean, like, Victor, I want to like connect over with thinking about like, I mean, as I was listening to one brother, and what is it? He said like, basically he's saying like, he says, empathy has a shelf life, but compassion is forever, right? So I think that there's something like that you're saying that like, first of all, understanding first and foremost the history, but also just the history of like how these are spiritual movements, right? And I'm not talking about and whether we talk, and I'm not talking about what other nomenclature you use to subscribe to or whatever, but just understanding that these are spiritual movements, and so they require that other part. They require that whole point of the spirit, right? And I really love that you brought that up, Victor, because like historically we look at this and it's like, man, like these people. I mean, when you talk about like hope, like Black hope is some radical, right? I mean, like when you say Black hope, because when Black people talk about hope, like we talk about Black hope, like it's really a situation of being like, well, I mean, it's not going to be a guarantee that it's going to happen the next day or whatever, but I got to stay engaged, right? And that's something that's very specific and very much a part of thinking about like this Black radical hope, right? It's the responsibility to just stay engaged and keep on going. And I mean, it looks, what I'm saying? Like Black hope in that sense, like we look at it like enacted. It looks like, John Lewis walking across Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? And then he's like, well, and along with everybody else, that community, it's like, we're going to, already we're going to get our heads bashed in or whatever, but we got to stay engaged, right? So there's that whole point of understanding that the importance of engagement. But I think that there's also a point to like thinking about like how there's always the question for me is, and this is something I've really tried to think about even further, whatever movement I go into, right? So whether I'm, going to, being solid, just thinking about what solidarity is and what that means for every movement or whatever. So it's like if I show up, to walk and to march and sit with my sisters or whatever, or to sit with my trans community, right? Then what that means is that I need to be asking the question always of what does it necessarily, first of all, thinking about who the constituency is and what does it necessarily mean to serve the constituency, right? So there's a point where I try to be so much better about showing up and saying to somebody or being like, trying to be clear of what is it that I am needed for, right? Because what you think that you might be bringing or you are needed for is not always what is needed, right? And this is an attempt to try to reduce the harm that we do, right? So a lot of things. So it's like I say this all the time. I'm like, look, if you show up and they need, and you need, and they're like, maybe we're thinking about like where I used to live in upstate New York, it was really a lot of labor work that was going on, right? You show up to a situation like this, anything, and you're thinking about the constituency. that you're trying to serve, you got to, they say like, hey, we need you to pack sandwiches, right? So you think about like what it means to really, serve the constituency. And I think that's the other part that I would, add to what Victor said.
I'd just like to say thank you, gentlemen, for enlightening us today and sharing your thoughts on this movement and also your own personal experiences. I really appreciate it.
It's been great, actually, to share a while with people from such diverse parts of the world and having such a nice and constructive and hopefully a little bit relevant conversation. It was fun. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you guys for jumping on board with this conversation and sharing all this with us. There will be some links posted on the notes to the article, to the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement website. And I guess if people have some questions or want to be part of this conversation, whether it's with us or with someone else, so they can feel free to do so and reach out to us or to whoever they think this conversation is going to be helpful.
Yeah, blessings to y'all, blessings and hugs to all y'all. Thank y'all so much. I mean, thank y'all for offering me sort of that's that spiritual space and that space of peace to have these conversations. It's so beautiful to be connected to y'all. Thank y'all.
Please write a review on our podcast whenever you listen to our podcast and let your friends know about us. You can learn more about Theatre Art Life by visiting our website at www.theatreartlife.com. And you can follow us on social media and leave your questions or comments on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter, or YouTube. We really want to thank David Zaya for composing the music for our podcast and Michelle Sharotta, who is our sound engineer. We are your hosts, Anna and Anna, and this is the Theatre Art Life podcast, where we put the spotlight on those who create live entertainment around the world.